The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Amen. A new king arose. A few words can mean an awful lot, and actually, especially in the language of Hebrew. Those words, a new king arose, should almost be heard with a dun, 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 come after them. Because it meant that there was a significant change about to happen. Because a new king arose, this time that they had enjoyed is over. So these words signify a drastic change and shift, and not a good one for the descendants of Jacob. They had indeed come down because of the famine down to Egypt. Joseph was able to save them, and even to save the nation of Egypt. And they enjoyed quite a few years of prosperity, abundance, children, and even prominence in Egypt. I mean, after all, Joseph single-handedly saved the empire from the famine that had come about. But this was now a different king. Probably even a couple of kings had passed since the one who really knew Joseph. So we have this new Pharaoh. And this new Pharaoh sees these outsiders as a threat to Egypt, a threat to his power, to his rule. And so his plotting begins. But don't forget a phrase that happened frequently throughout the Joseph story. God was with Joseph. And in turn, God was with his people, Joseph's family that had all gathered in Egypt as well. For over 3 generations, this family had multiplied and multiplied. They had enjoyed God's blessings of ancestors that was promised even so far back as Abraham. But that's where things become an issue for this Pharaoh. God's blessing of prosperity and multiplication for Jacob's family, that's the threat. That's the issue. This God's blessing of prosperity is now a problem. Now, in Scripture, we don't read anywhere about any evidence of the people of Israel, of Jacob's family and descendants, being a problem for the Egyptians. So what was he so afraid of? Was he afraid because they were of a different ethnicity or a different faith? Was he afraid of losing the power that he had? Was it something entirely different altogether? Who knows? We don't know. We're not really given any clue in Scripture either. He should have known the history of Joseph. It wasn't that far removed. It was a story I'm sure the people of Egypt could recall. And yet he willingly and deliberately forgets the story in order to grab on to power and to unite his people against a common perceived enemy. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but it's not the only time in our human history that this approach has been used. Prominent figures like Hitler in Germany, and frankly, even it's not uncommon in our political world today. But this particular Pharaoh's goal was to eradicate the Israelites. And then we begin to read about the couple phases of his plan, all of which seem to not succeed. First, he takes this entire nation of people and he enslaves them. He enslaves them, forcing them into harsh labor, building supply cities for the nation. Second, he instructs all of the midwives who help the women have their children that if it's a baby girl, let it live, but if it's a baby boy, kill it immediately. That's one way to end a race. When that doesn't work, when the women come back with their excuses that, well, the Hebrew women are, the word actually means full of life, vigor. It's their excuse. They have birth too early. The midwives don't even get there before the babies are born. It's their excuse because they just don't want to do it. They're afraid of God, a healthy fear of God, and they don't want to kill those babies. The third is that Pharaoh instructs all of Egypt, all of his country, that when they see a baby boy, they're to take it and throw it in the Nile River. And despite his best efforts, despite this plan, the people of Israel continue to grow and to multiply and develop. What's ironic to me in this whole story is that Pharaoh sees the baby girls as no threat whatsoever. And yet when we think about this entire story, the heroines that we find, the people who continue to thwart his plans, it's the women. They are the ones who are a threat to his power at this point. The midwives, Moses' mother and sister, and even Pharaoh's own daughter, who most actively and effectively thwart his plans for genocide. So with the resistance of these women, we find that this baby Moses survives and turns this plot of eradication into one that is the beginning of the Exodus story, the freeing of God's people, being saved from Egypt and finding their own place, their own land. God working through Moses is beginning an experience that forms the people of Israel from just the family of Jacob into the nation and the people of Israel, God's people. Exodus is a pretty amazing book. It's a book especially of identity, of God's people discovering who God is. They've been away from their land for so long, rediscovering who God is, and in turn, discovering again who they are as God's people. We're told, we have the writing, we're told exactly who Moses is. Moses is born of Levite blood, the priestly line. Couldn't be more Jewish than he was, couldn't be more Hebrew than he was. But circumstances would now mean that he would be raised as Egyptian royalty, which is also a reality for him. So that has to cause some inner conflict, I imagine, about who he really is. And we'll save that inner conflict for another week. But today, with this identity crisis, we also have to acknowledge that we belong to two worlds, two groups, and we need to think about what truly identifies us as well. Moses, as he is born, his mother looks at him and says the same exact words that God does at the beginning of creation. She looks at this baby boy and says, "It is good." And then she hides him for a while, and then eventually when she can't hide him any longer, she places him in a basket and sends him down the river. The other connection with that creation story that enables this to be a recreation of God's people is that the language, the word used for that basket is the exact same word used for the ark in the story of Noah. She sets him adrift. She sets him adrift, and the one that encounters him and finds him and then cares for him is Egyptian royalty, Pharaoh's daughter. So when we think about identity, Moses is Hebrew, Moses is Egyptian royalty, but more importantly, Moses is God's creation. That's what the language, I think, hearkening back to that creation story, is trying to remind us of, that, and even in the actions of the women to this point, that they are God's. They have a healthy fear and respect and even faith in God. Those women, they weren't ruled by the dictator of the day, who acted out of fear and hatred for this people that he didn't understand or didn't know. They acted out of faith in God. There's a phrase that gets used an awful lot in church lingo and perhaps overused at times. You've heard me say it before. The fact that we need to remember who we are and whose we are. And it's true. As much as it gets used or overused, it is a true statement that we need to remember who we are and whose we are. Moses, it would take him a while to remember whose he was. There are a lot of things in our culture that we choose to allow to define us. You can find studies, you can find polls, all kinds of demographic information that'll define us and classify us by race and wealth and class and geography, sexuality, gender, party, faith, probably any dozens of other things. Church leaders, we look at those same kinds of polls, those same kinds of data when we start making plans in a congregation. But my question is, instead of looking at all of the things that figure out how to divide us and figure out how to compartmentalize people, what if we simply chose to look at one another as Moses' mother looked at him? As part of God's creation and said, Ki Tov, which means it is good. We have these signs that went up around the church, actually the whole way back in June after our Synod Assembly. You've probably seen them. I haven't heard many comments about them, which is okay with me, but you've probably seen them. They're not a political statement. They are a statement of faith. They say, no matter where you are from, we are glad you're our neighbor. Because that's what God calls us to be, a neighbor to one another, regardless of our differences. Pharaoh made judgments about the Hebrew people, and there are many times when we are no different. We make judgments about one another on a regular basis. So many of them not even warranted. Paul writes in our second reading today, and I've always loved this phrase. He writes, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. What he's telling people is a dose of humility serves everyone well. We shouldn't seek to exalt ourselves over other people, and our judgments usually come from those places of ignorance or intolerance or our own insecurity. So this morning, we should be reminded of who we are and whose we are. When we do that, when we are reminded that we are Christians, we are people of God, disciples of Jesus Christ, then we should be less likely to draw those lines, to make those judgments, and be like Pharaoh. By knowing whose we are, we know that we are claimed. We know that we are forgiven. We know that we are fed. We know that we are loved as God's children. That leads us to be more tolerant, to be more loving, to be more compassionate. That's what Jesus was. That's who Jesus was. And as his disciples, we should strive to go and do likewise. Amen.